Chapter 15. Chasing Matrimony. Mrs. Brockett sat perched in her favourite armchair, her posture as rigid as her social aspirations, watching Mr. Bartholomew Winterton III sip his tea with what she deemed to be appropriately refined manners. Her eyes darted between her youngest daughter, Catherine, who was slouched most unbecomingly on the settee, and their distinguished guest. "I find the current political climate most propitious," declared Mr. Winterton, his jowls quivering with self-importance. "Oh, indeed, most malignant," agreed Mrs. Brockett, nodding vigorously. Catherine's eyes widened slightly at her mother's word choice, while Mr. Winterton's teacup paused briefly on its journey to his lips. The afternoon sun streamed through the glass double doors, illuminating the drawing-room's worn furniture and faded wallpaper in a way that Mrs. Brockett desperately hoped appeared artistic rather than decrepit. She had positioned Catherine directly in what she imagined to be the most flattering shaft of light, though her daughter seemed determined to fidget out of it at every opportunity. "Do tell us more about your estate, Mr. Winterton," Mrs. Brockett simpered, fixing Catherine with a glare that could have frozen hellfire. "Catherine is most passionate about estates." Catherine, who had been attempting to disappear into the settee's threadbare upholstery, muttered something inaudible and reached for her fourth scone. "Well," Mr. Winterton drew himself up importantly, "Winterton Hall boasts 17 bedrooms, though I occupy only the east wing these days. The rest I keep purely for aesthetic purposes." "How unutterably magnificent!" breathed Mrs. Brockett, mentally calculating the number of servants required to maintain such grandeur. "Catherine, my dear, do you not find Mr. Winterton's domestic arrangements utterly fascinating?" Catherine appeared to be studying the pattern on her teacup with unprecedented interest. "I should be delighted to show you both the grounds sometime," Mr. Winterton continued, his eyes fixed somewhere above Catherine's left ear. "The topiary alone requires 6 gardeners." Mrs. Brockett's smile stretched wider, taking on a somewhat predatory quality. 6 gardeners! How perfectly sublime! Catherine, my dear, do cease fidgeting with that cushion. Mr. Winterton is speaking of his topiary. "Though I must say," Mr. Winterton added, adjusting his cravat, "the upkeep is rather costly. One might say I find myself in need of certain financial arrangements." Mrs. Brockett's eyes gleamed with the intensity of a hunter spotting its prey. "How fascinating," she purred, mentally adding Catherine's modest dowry to the equation. "We are all so very interested in financial arrangements, are we not, Catherine?" Catherine had begun to look distinctly unwell. "Mother, I really don't think—" she began, but was cut short by an ominous rumbling from outside. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the thundering of hooves and the splintering of wood. Mrs. Brockett barely had time to register her horror before the glass double doors exploded inward in a shower of crystalline shards. A massive black carriage, its horses wild-eyed and foaming, crashed through the entrance. Time seemed to slow as Mrs. Brockett observed, with mounting horror, that her carefully arranged tea service was about to become airborne. The china, passed down through 4 generations of Brockets, described a graceful arc through the air before shattering against the wall. The carriage's momentum sent it careening through the drawing-room, its wheels catching on the Persian rug, admittedly a rather shabby imitation, but it had been her pride nonetheless. As the vehicle spun, its various straps and ropes whipped through the air like serpents, somehow managing to entangle Mrs. Brockett, Catherine and Mr. Winterton in their coils. "I say," exclaimed Mr. Winterton, his dignity somewhat compromised as he found himself suspended alongside the settee. "This is most irregular." Mrs. Brocket, now thoroughly entwined in the carriage's rigging, watched in mounting dismay as her carefully orchestrated tea party quite literally went to pieces. Yet even as she was dragged across her drawing-room floor, her mind remained fixed on one crucial fact. Mr. Winterton possessed 17 bedrooms. "Perhaps," she called out, attempting to maintain her composure while being pulled past her own portrait, "we might discuss the matter of estate management at a more convenient time." The only response was Catherine's shriek as the carriage, with its unwilling passengers in tow, proceeded to demolish Mrs. Brocket's prized collection of porcelain dogs. "The weather has been particularly fine for the season," Mrs. Brocket persisted, her voice rising above the cacophony of destruction. "Perfect for viewing topiary, I should think." The carriage showed no sign of slowing, and as they were dragged toward the opposite end of the room, Mrs. Brocket could have sworn she heard Mabel's distinctive cackle echoing from somewhere above stairs. She made a mental note to devise some particularly arduous duties for the maid, assuming they survived the next few minutes. "Mother!" Catherine wailed as they were pulled past the remnants of afternoon tea. "This really isn't the time." "Nonsense, dear," Mrs. Brocket replied, attempting to brush some debris from her dress while being dragged sideways. "There is always time for proper social discourse." The horses, apparently unimpressed by Mrs. Brocket's dedication to etiquette, continued their frenzied charge through the house, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake that would have brought tears to the eyes of any insurance assessor, had such a profession existed in Lesser Mudbury. The carriage thundered through the house with the force of Mrs. Brocket's social ambitions, leaving devastation in its wake. Their unwilling procession crashed through the music room, where the pianoforte gave one final discordant wail before succumbing to the chaos. "As I was saying," Mrs. Brocket called out, her voice bouncing with each bump and jolt, "Catherine is exceptionally accomplished at the pianoforte." She cast a meaningful glance at the instrument's remains as they were dragged past. "Or at least she was." Mr. Winterton, his face now an alarming shade of grey, appeared to be praying. Catherine had given up any pretence of dignity and was screaming with impressive lung capacity. "Really, Catherine," Mrs. Brocket chided as they careened through the portrait gallery, "such volume is most unbecoming in a potential mistress of 17 bedrooms." The horses, perhaps sensing Mrs. Brocket's determination to continue her matchmaking efforts despite their intervention, seemed to increase their pace. They charged through another set of doors, sending splinters of wood cascading around the entangled trio. "I must say," Mrs. Brocket continued, ducking to avoid a particularly large fragment of door frame, "this does give one such an innovative perspective of the house. Don't you agree, Mr. Winterton?" Mr. Winterton's response was lost in the crash as they entered the library. Books rained down around them, their pages fluttering like startled birds. Mrs. Brocket noted with displeasure that several volumes of Proper Conduct for Young Ladies seemed to be following their trajectory. "Mother!" Catherine managed between screams. "Can we please discuss my marriage prospects when we're not being dragged to our doom?" "Nonsense, dear. There's no time like the present. And do mind your posture. Even in crisis, a lady must maintain her bearing." The carriage burst through the final set of doors and into the bright afternoon sunshine. Mrs. Brocket, still clutching her teacup handle, the only survivor of her prized service, found herself surveying her gardens from an entirely new angle as they were pulled across the lawn. "Your roses are looking rather rushed," Mr. Winterton observed weakly as they ploughed through a flower bed. "Merely a new landscaping approach," Mrs. Brocket replied smoothly. "One must keep up with modern trends, you know. Speaking of which, Catherine has quite progressive views on garden design." The horses showed no sign of tiring as they thundered across the countryside, the carriage bouncing wildly over every hillock and hollow. Mrs. Brocket's carefully arranged hair had come entirely undone, but she maintained her grip on both the carriage strap and the conversation with equal tenacity. "I don't suppose," she ventured, raising her voice above the wind and Catherine's continued screaming, "that Winterton Hall has experienced anything similar. Such excitement does add character to an estate." Mr. Winterton, who had been attempting to protect his face from the barrage of branches they were now encountering, made a sound that might have been either agreement or terror. "Mother!" Catherine gasped, as they narrowly missed a particularly ancient oak tree. "Please, stop trying to arrange my marriage while we're about to die." "Die? Don't be melodramatic, dear. This is merely an unconventional afternoon constitutional. Mr. Winterton, you were saying earlier about your topiary?" The gentleman in question had lost his hat several fields back and was now watching his cravat flutter away into the distance. His previous air of pompous dignity had been replaced by an expression of pure horror as they approached a hedge at alarming speed. "Through, not over!" Mrs. Brocket commanded the horses, as though they might heed her instruction. To her satisfaction, they crashed through the greenery rather than attempting to jump it. "You see? Perfectly manageable. Now, about those 17 bedrooms." They emerged onto the main road to Lesser Mudbury, trailing leaves and dignity in equal measure. The carriage showed no signs of slowing, though it had acquired a distinctive wobble that suggested at least one wheel was reconsidering its life choices. "I find," Mrs. Brocket announced, brushing some twigs from her dress with her free hand, "that such adventures really allow one to assess compatibility in trying circumstances. Would you not agree, Mr. Winterton?" Mr. Winterton, who had been reduced to whimpering, seemed disinclined to respond. Catherine had progressed from screaming to a sort of resigned sobbing that Mrs. Brocket found most unbecoming. "Really, Catherine," she admonished, "Mr. Winterton will think you unused to carriage rides. Do try to show some enthusiasm for the local scenery." The local scenery was now passing by at a speed that rendered it little more than a blur, but Mrs. Brocket remained undaunted. She had not spent weeks orchestrating this meeting, only to let a minor inconvenience like a runaway carriage derail her plans for social elevation. "I believe I can see the town approaching," she observed brightly. "Perhaps we might discuss wedding dates over dinner. Assuming, of course, we managed to stop at some point." The horses, as if in direct defiance of her optimism, seemed to gather fresh energy as they thundered toward Lesser Mudbury. Behind them, the Brocket estate grew smaller, its broken windows and shattered doors testament to their dramatic exit. "Mother," Catherine pleaded, "please stop talking about weddings." "Nonsense, dear. There's never an inappropriate moment for discussing one's future prospects, though I do wish you'd stop getting your dress so dirty. First impressions are everything, you know." The fact that they were all now covered in an impressive collection of leaves, twigs, and countryside debris seemed, in Mrs. Brocket's mind, a mere trifling detail in the greater scheme of matrimonial success. The carriage thundered into Lesser Mudbury with all the subtlety of Mrs. Brocket's matchmaking tactics. Market-day shoppers scattered like startled pigeons as the procession careened down the high street, leaving a wake of overturned carts and scattered produce. "How fortuitous," Mrs. Brocket declared, narrowly avoiding a flying cabbage. "The whole town can witness our delightful social engagement, though I must say the pace is rather brisk for a proper promenade." Catherine had long since exhausted her capacity for screaming, and now hung limply in her bonds, occasionally whimpering when they hit a severe bump. Mr. Winterton's complexion had progressed from grey to a fascinating shade of green. "I do hope," Mrs. Brockett continued, raising her voice above the chaos of splintering market stalls, "that you're noting Catherine's admirable stamina, Mr. Winterton. Such resilience would be most valuable in managing 17 bedrooms. The carriage swerved violently, sending them on a trajectory through Mrs. Higgins's millinery shop window. A cascade of bonnets rained down upon them, one particularly garish creation landing askew on Mrs. Brockett's head. "How serendipitous," she remarked, attempting to adjust the bonnet with her one free hand. "I was just thinking we ought to discuss Catherine's trousseau." "Madam," Mr. Winterton managed through clenched teeth, "I really must insist—" "Yes, Mrs. Brockett interrupted. "We can discuss the wedding date later, though I do think spring would be lovely, assuming we survive until then." They emerged from the millinery shop trailing ribbons and feathers, adding a festive air to their catastrophic progress. The horses, perhaps inspired by their decorative passengers, seemed to increase their pace. "Mother!" Catherine found her voice again as they narrowly missed the town's only statue. "For heaven's sake, stop talking about weddings." "Such spirit!" Mrs. Brockett beamed at Mr. Winterton. "You see how passionate she becomes about matrimonial matters?" Mr. Winterton's response was lost in the general commotion as they rounded the corner onto Church Street at a speed that would have scandalized the local vicar, had he not been too busy diving into a hedge to avoid their path. Ahead, a group of quick-thinking townspeople had begun constructing a barrier of carts and barrels across the street. The horses, finally confronted with an obstacle they couldn't simply crash through, began to slow. Their progress became increasingly erratic as they approached the barrier, until finally, with a tremendous jolt that sent all three passengers swinging like peculiar pendulums, they came to a stop. "Well," Mrs. Brockett announced, hanging upside down and still clutching her teacup handle, "that was invigorating, I dare say. Now, about those wedding plans." But Mr. Winterton, finally freed from his bonds by the gathering townspeople, was already staggering away in the direction of the nearest pub for a stiff drink. His usual pompous demeanour had been replaced by something approaching panic as he attempted to put as much distance between himself and Mrs. Brockett as possible. "This is absolutely unconscionable," he spluttered, his cravat now more of a suggestion than an actual garment. "I have never been so humiliated in all my life." Catherine, also released and looking like she'd been dragged through a hedge, which in fact she had, numbering several, seized the opportunity to flee in the pub's direction too. "I would rather die a spinster," she declared, limping toward the nearest pub with surprising speed for someone who had just been dragged across half the county. "Double brandy! Don't keep me waiting!" Mrs. Brockett, still entangled in various straps, and now sporting an impressive collection of ribbons, feathers and leaves, drew herself up as best she could while suspended sideways. "How dare you!" she shrieked after their retreating forms. "After I went to all this trouble to arrange such a unique courtship experience. Mr. Winterton, you come back this instant. Think of the 17 bedrooms. Spotting a piece of broken carriage wheel nearby, she managed to grab it and, with surprising accuracy for someone in her position, hurled it in their direction. It bounced harmlessly off a lamp-post, but the gesture gave her a moment's satisfaction. "You'll regret this!" she called out, her voice reaching new heights of indignation. "Both of you! And I'll be sending you the bill for my china!" As the townspeople worked to free her from her predicament, Mrs. Brocket's mind was already calculating her next move. "You there!" she commanded the nearest bystander. "Fetch me a carriage at once, and do make sure it's properly secured this time." She paused, brushing some debris from her dress with as much dignity as she could muster. "Oh, and have them drive past the hospital on the way home. I seem to have developed a slight headache." The bonnet, now barely recognizable as such, slipped rakishly over one eye as she was finally set upright. Behind her, the wreckage of the carriage and the scattered remains of market day created a tableau that would become part of Lesser Mudbury's cherished lore, though never, of course, within Mrs. Brocket's hearing.